Welcome to Spectral Shadows. This is the place where the stories don't just haunt your mind, they follow you into the dark. Before the whispers begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight? Or closer to the hour when shadows move on their own? If you're brave enough to continue, prove it. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows and leave a comment with your time and location, so we'll know exactly where to find you. Now, let's open the door to tonight's nightmare. Story number 1. 3 years ago, my friend group decided to go on a camping trip. Not just going to an RV park and chilling kind of camping, but a proper tent and campfire trip. See, I'm a chronic glamper. If given the choice between roughing it out in the wild and chilling in an air-conditioned RV, I'm picking the RV every time. I enjoy my creature comforts, and I always have. Jake, one of the guys that runs in our little group, prides himself on being a true outdoorsman, as our group usually ends up taking trips to nearby lakes and national parks. It's become a bit of a strain between the two of us. It'd be one thing if he could respect that I'm not here to have the authentic experience and just want to have fun. But he can't. He needles and mutters about how they could be going to cooler places if only we didn't have to always glamp to get out of the damn house. I think that's why I accepted his trip proposal. Normally I'd shut it down without question, but he'd been getting on my nerves for years. I accepted, thinking I'd prove once and for all that I can do it the rough and tough way. Maybe then he'd leave me the hell alone. Jake planned out a trip for us and our other 2 friends to a nearby lake on his family's property. When we arrived, I tried to ask where exactly in there we were going, but he'd just smirk. "Relax, Maddie. The trails are marked. Even you won't get lost." Behind me, Chris and Luke, the other 2 coming with us, started up a conversation about s'mores and the supposed lake at the place we're going to. I felt my shoulders relax. Jake pulled out a compass and led us due north. According to him, we had to follow the compass a little ways until we found some trees he and his family had marked with red triangles. From there, you follow the path. The sun was going down by the time we spotted the first red triangle. I checked my phone, which said it was about 7:30. I also checked my signal. Nothing. The pack straps were digging into my shoulders, and Luke was huffing as he trudged behind Chris and me. Funny. Despite the fact that Luke was obviously the least capable of us, it's still me that Jake liked to piss on. "Jake," I called. He paused and turned to me, a familiar irritated expression on his face. "Can we pause for a minute? I gotta take a piss." I didn't mention that Luke looked ready to puke, but he seemed to see it anyway when he looked at him. Jake huffed. "Don't get lost. I want to get to our site so we can get set up." I dropped my pack to the ground and started walking off the trail some. I could hear Luke wheezing behind me, obviously tired from the trek. The woods were quiet as I broke from the trail. I listened around for the birds or crickets, but it was dead silent. I glanced over my shoulder, making sure I was far enough away, and relieved myself. I zipped up and began to turn back when a branch cracked behind me. My head snapped back in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing. I turned and began walking back, and the crunching of leaves started behind me. I stopped, and so did the noise. It was my own footsteps. It had to be. But I started again, faster this time, and nearly broke into a run when the crunching just seemed to get louder and louder. I busted through the tree line, hitting the trail and whirling around to see what had been on my heels. Nothing. I stared out at the forest, waiting. There wasn't even a rustle of leaves from the wind, just silence. "Matt, let's go," Chris called, breaking my staring contest with the empty trees. I turned and jogged up the trail to catch up with them. As I picked my pack up off the ground, I couldn't stop myself from asking, "Did you guys hear that?" They all turned to look at me. "Hear what?" Luke answered. I couldn't quite bring myself to spit it out. After all, what had I heard? Leaves crunching when I walked? I shook my head. Jake continued to lead us towards the campsite, the red triangles leading us ever onwards. I looked at them closer as we passed. They were spray-painted on, with each tree being marked on both sides, so that they could be seen no matter the direction you were coming from. Each marker was about 5 meters apart, and at any given time, you could see the next few up ahead. The sun was nearly set when we broke through to the spot by the lake. I had to hand it to the bastard. The sight was beautiful. The trees all stood in glorious formation, shades of green mottled with the golden light of the sunset. The water shined a slightly muddy blue-gray, peppered with that same golden light stretching through the trees. We each picked a spot to pitch our tents. Luke and I got put on tent duty, while Chris and Jake, our 2 more experienced outdoorsmen, went out to find some good sticks for firewood. As I finished getting my tent up, I glanced over at Luke. He was struggling to get the stakes in the ground. I sighed, turning to help. We got his tent pitched and worked together to get the other 2 up. As we were finishing up with Chris's tent, the other 2 came back. I could see Jake looking over his tent, probably ready to find something to criticize me on. I was proud when he couldn't find anything. Chris and Jake threw some of the wood into the spot we'd designated as our fire pit, putting the rest of it close by for later use. They got the fire started, and we all idly chatted as the sun sank beneath the hills. Luke got up and brought his backpack over. As he unzipped the pack and reached in, I smiled. Hershey's chocolate bars, a box of graham crackers, giant fluffy marshmallows. I glanced over and saw my grin mirrored on Chris's face. Jake rolled his eyes, but obligingly got up to grab some sticks to roast the marshmallows on. We gorged ourselves on granola bars and s'mores as the world around us turned dark. "Hey, Matt," Chris started. I looked at him, mouth and hands sticky with melted sugar. "Earlier today when you ran off to take a piss, what was that all about?" I looked at him puzzled. "You ran out of there like a bat out of hell. Then you were all, 'Did you guys hear that?'" He pitched his voice up, and my eye twitched. He grinned goofily at me. I didn't quite know what to say. I didn't want to scare Luke, who was looking a bit nervous, and I still wasn't convinced I hadn't made the whole thing up. "I thought I heard something behind me," I settled on. "Branch snapped kinda loud, and it freaked me out." Jake snorted. "Really? All that fuss over a branch cracking? In the woods?" Yeah, I know. That's why I dropped it. It wasn't much." Chris and Luke exchanged a look, seeming to sense that wasn't quite it. But Jake was snickering at my foolishness, and neither quite seemed like they wanted to press. We all went to bed after putting the fire out. I tossed and turned some, but overall, the night passed on without incident. In the morning, we all woke up to the sound of Jake hollering that if we wanted to fish, now was the time before it got too hot. The lake was a blast. We sat around fishing for a while, chatting as the sun rose up in the sky. The fish were particularly hesitant to bite, but as Chris launched into a story, I found myself having a good time anyways. We scrambled some eggs we'd brought along in Jake's fancy cooler over the fire when we got too hungry. I considered asking him if bringing food in was cheating, but it wasn't worth the fight. At about noon, we started swimming. The water was nice and warm from the summer heat, and I spent a good chunk of time just floating and soaking up the sun. That, of course, was ruined when Luke snuck up on me underwater and grabbed me around the gut. flipping me over and giving me a nose full of lake water. We splashed around for a good long while. The thing that drove us back to the shore was our grumbling stomachs. Luke and I were chatting excitedly about finding some good sticks for roasting the hot dogs we'd brought along when I ran straight into Chris's back. "Whoa, Chris! Dude, what's—" I paused. Chris and Jake were just staring towards our campsite. I followed their gaze. Plastic littered the ground. All the meat we had brought with us had been torn out of its packages and was gone, leaving only the wrappers behind. Luke's tent, which had the marshmallows and chocolate, had its flap shredded. The flap was still zipped up closed, but the middle was gaping like an open wound. My blood ran cold. Luke had caught up and was looking as nervous as me. Even Jake looked shaken. I mean, we are in bear territory. I tried to reason. Guess we should have locked down the food a bit better. Jake looked pissed. "You think I didn't plan for that? No damn bear is getting into these containers. I don't even know why they would. The meat's all packaged. They say bears are pretty smart. Maybe they—" Luke tried. That cooler had a lock on it no bear could undo. It'd have to bust the damn thing open. Silence weighed heavily on us as we looked at the cooler. The nice, shiny, pristine cooler. "Maybe we should head back. I mean, we don't have any food left," Luke suggested nervously. I looked up at the sky. The sun was still relatively high, but it was rapidly sinking down. It'd be dark by the time we made it back to our cars. Then I looked over at Luke's tent. I stared at the shredded door, the carefully opened backpack. What was worse? Risking getting lost in the woods, or risking staying? That wasn't a real choice, and I knew it. "Let's get our stuff packed up and let's go. We have our heavy-duty flashlights," I said. Chris and Luke didn't need any convincing. They hustled to get their tents taken down and their stuff ready. Jake looked hesitant. "I don't think leaving now is a good idea. He checked his watch. "Already 5:30. By the time we get back, it'll be dark, I know," I agreed. "But it's either that or staying here for another night." He huffed and started getting his stuff together. My tent came down easy enough, and I had all my stuff packed quick. When I shrugged on my pack and turned to the other guys, I could see Jake stomping out the fire embers and grabbing his compass. "Everyone got their lights?" he said, bad mood evident. Chris and Luke nodded, although Luke looked vaguely ill at the thought of navigating by flashlight. I wasn't faring much better. We all started back the way we came in. Jake took the lead, following the trail markers. Luke followed close behind him. Chris and I took up the rear, keeping pace beside one another. "You think it was a bear?" he asked. I shrugged. "Dunno, never actually had an encounter with one." "I have," he said. "Dad and I went camping when I was a kid. Family next to us on the grounds didn't properly store up their trash." "You saw it?" "Sure did. Black bear. Ugly thing. Spawned a whole lecture from my dad about how to properly store food and trash so you don't attract them." He paused. "Not gonna lie to you, Matt. I don't think this was a bear." I waited for him to elaborate, but he just looked at the cooler Jake was carrying. We followed all the safety precautions. Not just that. We were pretty damn close to the shore, splashing and running around, just lots of noise. Bears don't like noise. "Jake, what way do we go?" Luke called, interrupting our silent musing. I looked up from my feet, confused. The spray-painted red triangle was visible on the tree ahead of us. Jake paused. "What way do we—" He glanced around. I took the opportunity to do the same. Luke was practically bouncing from foot to foot in his eagerness to go. "Where's the other path go off to? Another part of the lake?" he asked, giving a nervous laugh. Jake wasn't laughing, though. In fact, he was turning an alarming shade of white. I could feel his sudden fear radiating off of him. I was starting to match it. Beyond the tree with our marker, I could distinctly see two paths marked in the same fashion. One veered off slightly to the left, and the other veered off slightly to the right. The marker was dead center. We'd have to choose a path. "Jake, which one goes to our cars?" I asked. It was a testament to how stunned he was that he didn't tear me a new one over for questioning him. There'd only been one path coming up, and it was straight as an arrow. We hadn't even taken a little side step, had just marched straight through the woods. Neither of these paths went straight forward like we had when we came up. So what was this? A whole new split, complete with a line of markers for a path that wouldn't take us back to our cars. "Jake, you and your family put these markers up, right? Which way do we go?" I asked, urgency creeping into my voice. I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "We never really went out from the path. We definitely didn't mark a new path, and we wouldn't mark with the same damn markers." I looked up again. The sun had crept further down, painting the sky with a faint shade of orange. We were getting closer and closer to sunset. "Jake, are you sure we're going the right way?" Chris asked. I turned to see him and Luke huddled together behind us. "Yes, we go right. Ignore the damn markers on the left. We go right." "How do we know, though? I mean, those aren't the same markers we followed, right? There was only one path coming up," Chris nervously asked. Jake let out a frustrated huff. He slung his pack to the ground and walked over to a tree with some low-hanging branches. "I'll climb up here and find the clearing we parked near. That way, we can ignore the damn markers and go to the road. Happy?" He snarled before grabbing the branch and beginning to climb. We watched him climb till about halfway up. When the leaves began to obscure him, I could hear the branches rustling as he continued his climb. "Well," Chris hollered. "I see the road," Jake yelled back. We all let out a sigh of relief. "This whole trip has been a bit of a nightmare," I commented. Chris and Luke both nodded. I waited to hear the crackling of the branches as Jake climbed down. They never came. We waited there at the bottom for what felt like an eternity. "Jake, buddy, you coming down from there?" Chris called. No answer. I frowned, trying to see through the thick canopy. Suddenly I heard the sound of something hurtling through the branches. The crashing was fast, a free fall, as whatever it was collided with everything in its path. I jumped back in time to avoid being knocked over the head with whatever it was that had fallen. I looked down. A hiking boot lay sideways on the ground, its ties unlaced. I looked back up into the canopy. The wind blew a little harder, shuffling the leaves just enough for me to see higher up the tree. Jake was gone. I blinked once, twice, before turning back to the others. Chris and Luke both were staring at the shoe. Luke had Chris's arm in a vice grip, his breathing beginning to speed up in a telltale sign of panic. Chris looked back up. "Jake, where the hell are you? This ain't funny." Still silent. We waited 5 minutes, then 10. The only noise around us was the wind rustling through the leaves, and the sound of Luke getting more and more antsy. When 15 had passed, I turned to Chris. "Left or right?" He looked at me, startled. "What path? Left or right?" "Dude, what are you talking about? We can't leave Jake." "Jake's gone. I don't know how or why. He seems to think it's funny to leave us here, scaring us half to death." I took a deep breath. "We gotta get back to our cars. Leave his pack there. When he wants to stop scaring the shit out of us, he can catch up." Chris paused for a long, tense moment before sighing. "Yeah, okay." He looked over at the two paths in front of us. "Look down the left and see if it looks familiar. I'll look down the right." I nodded and walked towards the left path. Chris and Luke began towards the right, looking down it to try and find some indication that was the right path. I walked to the first marker on the left. I couldn't understand why there were suddenly two paths. It didn't make any damn. I stilled. In front of me, a line of wet red had dripped down from the triangle. I watched it gleam wet in the setting sun. This marker was new, and now that I was closer to it, I could smell the tang of copper. My heart seized in my chest, and I quickly cut across the paths to Chris and Luke, who were discussing their trail. They turned to me as I approached. I think this might be it. Both sides of the tree are marked the same way it was when we... It's this one. The other. I sucked in a ragged breath. The other one's fresh. Fresh? The hell you mean? Chris started. I cut him off. It wasn't paint. The red is wet. It's fresh. Someone painted a new path with the same marker. That's so messed up. Why the hell would... Chris, it's not paint. Luke, who had been watching the exchange, cut in. What do you mean it's not paint? What else would it... I could see the moment it clicked for him. Chris, too, tensed in realization. Is this some kind of joke? You and Jake? He asked, voice dangerously low. I whirled on him, almost hissing in rage. You think I'd plan something like this? With him of all people. The bastard can't even look at me without a comment on how shit I am at everything. The only reason he even lowered himself enough to pass me an invite is because he knew the two of you would want me to come along. And you think, what? Plan some scary, haunted trail? Even as I said it, I knew he didn't. Neither of them did. They both just wanted some rational explanation for all of this. I pushed past Chris to check the trail marker. I got close and checked it. My heart about stopped. It was wet. I turned back towards the clearing we were in before, charging across towards the markers we had been following. Wet, wet, wet. All tinged with a coppery smell we'd been marching by too quickly to notice. I turned back towards Chris and Luke, and saw Chris was right behind me. They're all wet? He asked, wrinkling his nose as the smell hit him. We shared a glance, looking at the triangle nearest to us. Now what? I couldn't help but wonder. Here we were, in a rapidly darkening forest, lost without anyone who was even slightly familiar with the area. I've got a compass in my pack, Chris answered. He set his pack on the ground and rummaged through it for a while, before triumphantly pulling out the instrument. Jake had his on him when he went up that tree, but I have my own. He pointed in a direction off to our right. South is that way. We go that direction. We should get close to the road. As long as you and me and Luke stay close together, we'll be fine. I nodded and turned towards where Luke was. You hear that? We'll be fine. We just stick together and... Luke was gone. Nausea slammed into me, turning my limbs into goo. Chris wildly looked around, calling for Luke. I grabbed onto his sleeve, terrified. Chris, I said, keeping my voice low. He stopped his frantic yelling and looked at me. Chris, we need to get to the road and get back to our cars. Matt, we can't just leave Luke here. Jake knows this place, but Luke... Chris, we get to the car and we go somewhere with signal and call the cops. They can come out here with dogs and search and rescue teams. But for right now, we have to go. I could see him internally fighting a battle, but in the end, he nodded. I kept a hold of his sleeve as he led us south. The woods finally got dark enough that I grabbed the flashlight with my free hand. Chris went to grab his too, but I stopped him. I've got the light. You keep leading us straight. He didn't fight me. He just nodded and continued leading us. Finally, I could see something between the trees. The road. I could hear Chris give a little sigh of relief, and we both started walking a little faster. Where's the other path go off to? Another part of the lake? A voice called behind us. We stopped. Dread crawled up my spine, as Luke's voice washed over me. Chris was about to turn and call when I let go of his arm and covered his mouth. He looked at me, angry, when the voice came again. "Jake, what way do we go?" I felt a whimper crawl up my throat. I met Chris's eyes and jerked my head in the direction of the road. He nodded. We crept forward, taking care to keep our steps as light as possible. Behind us, sounding like he was wandering the forest, Luke's voice continued. The nausea increased tenfold as I realized it was just repetitions of things he had said earlier. The road ahead of us was clearer than ever, and as if heaven itself was lighting the way, it was lit in a soft golden glow. Chris broke free of my grasp and ran forward. The crunching of leaves and sticks beneath him caused the voice to stop, and suddenly the sound of something barreling through the trees made its way to my ears. I sprinted after Chris, unwilling to turn and see what was behind us. We broke from the tree line, scared to death. The noise behind us didn't slow down. "Run across the road. Run," I called, not even slightly slowing. I vaguely noticed that the light seemed to be getting brighter, but I ignored it in favor of sprinting harder. Chris cleared the road, and I was right behind him. I heard an odd noise, almost like brakes squealing. I spun around in time to see something big behind us get thrown forward across the road as a car slammed into it. My jaw dropped as everything seemed to come to a stop. The car was dented on the hood, and its driver stumbled out, confused. I didn't hesitate. Neither did Chris. We ran up to her, urging her back into the car. I think she caught sight of what it was she hit, because she just faintly told us to get in the back. We clambered in as she put the car in reverse and turned the car around. She started the car back towards town, and I couldn't help but stare out the back window. As the driver took a turn and the thing was going out of view, I saw it twitch and begin to rise up. The driver's name was Eve, and she was trying to head home from a work trip in another city. She'd been passing through by pure happenstance and was grilling us on what the hell that thing was. A deer? An elk? A moose? It's awful far down south for moose. But damn if that sucker wasn't big. I just asked her to drop us off at the police station. She looked back at us, confused, but said that was fine. I closed my eyes. When we got there, we told them the whole story. They obviously had some questions, and I knew they didn't believe us on multiple parts. They told us not to leave town, and that they'll have some more questions for us later. They took us up in the morning to get our cars. When we got to the spot we'd parked, the cops looked just as baffled as Chris and I had felt this whole trip. Every window of all 4 cars was shattered. The tires were slashed with great big gashes, and the trunks had been ripped open by force. Luke's car even had a door ripped off its hinges, the offending piece of metal bent out of shape a few yards away. The cops just took us home. They never found Jake or Luke. Chris and I still keep in touch every now and again. I think that trip put a strain on our friendship. Eve and I, meanwhile, got a whole lot closer. So close, in fact, she's right here beside me as I type this. I don't know what's prompting me to recall this, maybe some form of exposure therapy, or a way to get it off my chest. I'm not sure. All I know is that I'm never going camping again. Story number 2. I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina, 30 minutes outside of the town of Asheville. The hills and hollers of the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, with some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with most things that have been on the Earth a long time, there are inexplicable anomalies, both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them from Wiseman's view. They're neither good nor evil. They just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes when you walk through an abandoned old church, up near Mom and Dad's property line, you can feel good, warm, and happy energy. It's like that first warm day of summer when the sunshine is not too hot, but it's not cold. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly. It's about something that was definitely malevolent. About a decade ago, I was in night school up at AB Tech, going to school for automotive mechanics. I would go into class at about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job, and I would end up getting home about 10:30 p.m., depending on traffic. Every night I drove the same road, in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights it would get rather boring, and I would take a different route, jump off of I-40, and drive the back roads. On this particular evening, I had decided to just stay on I-40 because I just wanted to go home and go to bed. It was Thursday, and there was no class on Friday, and I wanted to get in bed early so I could go out into the woods and go hiking early tomorrow morning and watch the sun come up. As I jumped off of I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, the night seemed to get darker, and none of the animals that I could hear through my rolled-down windows made any more noise. The cab of my truck became smaller and smaller, and my breathing quickened. I have never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment, something felt off, and there was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp, turned to go down the road, and I happened to notice that the gas station off the exit where Mom and Dad lived had no lights on. They were a 24-hour truck stop and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to the power being out, but I could not shake the feeling that something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all of my old truck's gears, not wanting to make any more noise than an old pickup already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield, and there were barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, you can see the Milky Way on clear nights. An absence of stars back home is only due to cloud cover, or whatever in the hell went on this particular night. As I rounded a particularly sharp left-hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch before the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient, decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road, and thought about how long that thing had been here and how many advancements and civilization it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly-looking dog ran out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. Thump thump. I heard the fence posts I had left in my truck bounce up out of my bed and then back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh God, now I have to go tell these neighbors that I ran over their dog. That shit doesn't go real far with people around here. It can really kind of set them off depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you ever forget once you smell it one time. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I just chalked it up to some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me go check and see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked in my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog. Only it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It had stood up like a man well over 10 feet tall. Only then did it dawn on me that the front of my truck was every bit of 5 feet tall, and this dog was every bit of 5 feet tall at the shoulder on all fours. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog, it was not a man. It was somewhere in between, and at the same time entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose off its emaciated and thin frame, like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur and dirt and mud clung to its legs like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left, and they both hung abnormally low in relation to either animal this creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man's, but the very edges of its face seemed to not be totally defined. They seemed to move and change like something you would see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes, but only sockets where eyes should have been. No hair, and the skin that was dripping off its face was a cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face like a bulldog, but the teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous, and true to form of the rest of its unnatural look, many of the teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the indefinable face, almost like they knew the horror they occupied, and they were searching for a way out. It stared through my life, into my eyes, and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there, paralyzed. A light came on at the house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its gaze in that direction and tear off into the woods on its back, 2 legs, like a man. I jammed my old truck in first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched second gear, and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both of my parents were asleep. I went downstairs into my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all of the doors. I couldn't wake them up. Who the fuck would believe that? And at 10:30 on a Thursday night. The basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dogs that got up to raise hell at outside animals at all hours of the night were dead silent. The old post and beam house didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At about 3 a.m., I started to finally get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down to get some sleep so I could still attempt to go hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, you're just going crazy. None of that shit was real, but as I dwelt on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with 2 large glass doors that face Pisgah National Forest, an impenetrable 500,000-acre woods. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement living room with my little tactical 12-gauge, loaded, tack light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand so as not to make my presence known until need be, and as I turned right out of the living room into my father's office, I shined the light through the glass doors, and at the edge of the woods, there stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets devoid of eyes. I quickly covered my tactical light, ran into the living room, flipped on the outdoor floodlights, and to my surprise, it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the edge of the woods, still motionless. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have scored a couple of hits because it screeched an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered. As it took off into the woods, the dogs went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up, asking me what the hell I was doing. I told them that a bear had gotten into the trash, and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me. But I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and father's. Up on the side of the holler there are kennels for her brother's hunting dogs, no longer in use and haven't been in years, but the fence is still there, and the concrete pad is still there. It's a thing of great use when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a tussle with a raccoon, which of course he destroyed. But his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him. He kind of likes solitude. This particular night that we were coming home from a movie date in a neighboring town was the last night of quarantine for him. So we walked up the trail, using our phone flashlights, to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking back to the house with him. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel the same feeling I had felt the night I hit the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything so as not to alarm my wife, but then the smell came wafting in on the breeze. She jokingly asked me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I half-ass laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horrors that raged within my mind. She immediately caught on and asked me what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sounded just like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and so he turned to face the danger, belting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks and is no easy task. I'm 6 feet tall and 240 pounds, and it was all I could do to get him back to the house. The barking never ceased the entire time we were running towards the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer and closer until it seemed it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on as we made it into the fence of the yard, and I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end of where the light reached, wheeling around and tearing off back into the darkness. My wife looked at me and goes, "You want to tell me what the fuck that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's go inside." I told her the story, and she listened intently, hanging on every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers of the Appalachians. So her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked, and the chain-link fence was torn off of its posts. The dog houses were destroyed, and the place reeked of the stench that followed the creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, burnt some herbs, and led us back into the property. When we got in the house, she wheeled about on us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark. Not until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military, and she ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who's lived around fairly large mountains and endless wilderness their entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least that was my thought when we first moved into the middle of a 50,000-plus population city. Fortunately, though, it didn't take us long to find a house in a sleepy little community further south. we purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. The sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy that goes one way or the other. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having not thought about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark and playing with our dogs in our rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark set in, I built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian mountain cough syrup from a mason jar. And just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he could not get away. As I tackled his 110-pound ass to the ground and threw him in a fireman's carry over my shoulders, I heard him begin to bark. Only the bark was not coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep, rumbling growl, a noise I've never heard him make. It was a threatening noise. Something was definitely wrong. As I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. The two other dogs must have caught wind of what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and again loaded my firearms. How the hell could this thing have followed us 650 miles up here? As I flipped my floodlights on at the back side of my house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest's edge were still shaking, like something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out the windows. I didn't sleep a bit, and I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life. Not until this thing is gone. Story number 3. Back in 2006, my then-girlfriend bugged me for months to go camp on the Appalachian Trail. Since we lived relatively close by, we planned an overnight trip for a following weekend and quickly cobbled together a plan. We should have packed the day before, because by the time we were ready, it was mid-afternoon. I'm an experienced camper, and I knew the sun would be going down right around the time I figured we'd get there. Jen still wanted to go, so we loaded our heavy packs and the dogs in the car and got on the road. We had to drive a bit of a ways to get there, and indeed, the sun was close to going down by the time we arrived. We pulled into the parking lot at the trailhead and began to unload. It made us nervous that there was a man just sitting in his car in the parking lot. The engine was running, but he wasn't doing anything, just sitting there. We kind of took our time, hoping that he would drive off, because it made us nervous that a guy was sitting there watching two girls hike off into the woods. More unnerving was that, with the sun going down, we wouldn't get far enough from the parking lot to feel safe. We tried to outweight the man, but he continued to sit there with his engine running, doing nothing. Losing daylight, we couldn't wait anymore and headed onto the trail with the dogs. We hiked for a bit, apparently not far from a highway, as we could hear traffic the entire time. Right around the time when we'd have to stop due to darkness, we passed a shelter with 3 or 4 people camping and cooking dinner. They were young and friendly, at least one girl in the mix. We said hello in passing and hiked on another few hundred yards, where a campsite appeared just a ways off the trail. We kept walking, but wound up losing the trail because it was getting too dark to make it out. Jen wanted to keep going, but I was most scared about losing the light before finding wood and getting set up. So I put my foot down, and we doubled back to the vacant campsite. At the very least, we were within screaming distance of the other campers, should anything happen. I set up the tent, and Jen began to search around for firewood. It was odd, because we lived in a nearby area, and it hadn't rained recently. But everything on the forest floor was wet, wood and kindling included. We then went into panic mode when we realized we might not get a fire started. The sun was fading fast. Fortunately, I'd brought a roll of toilet paper, so Jen set about trying to start a fire with that, and I frantically crashed through the woods, searching the bases of trees for the driest wood possible. All of the wood was so wet that Jen was struggling to keep even the smallest pieces burning for any length of time. We switched places, and I began to baby that fire as best I could. But it was difficult. It just wouldn't catch. After a while of crashing around in the dark woods, our headlamp began to die, and then our flashlight as well. We then realized that we hadn't thought to put in new batteries. I was in full-on survival mode because the TP was running out. I marvel now at how I did not even care at all about grabbing stuff with my bare hands, or about what kind of giant spider web I might walk into. I just had to get enough fairly dry wood for the fire to catch before the headlamp died. Like a machine, I gathered armfuls of the driest sticks and logs I could find, dropped them by the fire pit, and continued to race the headlamp's demise. After a great deal of sweat and tears, we managed to get the fire going and eventually built up enough to boil water. We celebrated our victory with a little of the wine we'd brought in a Nalgene, but then we soon realized that we had forgotten something important. Utensils. It was dark and we were pretty hungry at that point, so I improvised and stirred with a stick. We then ate our food off our plates with our hands like savages, feeling really stupid about forgetting forks. Once we cleaned up, we settled in front of the fire with our wine and chilled out. Everything around us was peaceful, and the dogs were fast asleep. We let the fire die down and headed into the tent, where there were some intimate shenanigans, and then we went to sleep. At about 3 a.m., I woke up for no reason, like no noise or anything. But Jen was awake and quietly freaking out next to me. When she saw that I was awake, she whispered that she was scared and to just listen, so I did. First, I heard the sound of the highway in the distance, then night insects. But then I heard two very weird things that put me on edge. The first was the sound of thick branches snapping in the woods close by, but no other rustling like I would associate with deer or even bear. By the sound and loudness of the snaps, these were large branches, like 3 inches in diameter. So whatever was breaking them had to be large. But why couldn't we hear any movement through the brush and leaves? It was all quiet, and then, snap. As I lay there, feeling increasingly freaked out and vulnerable in the tent, I began to notice another noise. They would come one at a time, but it sounded just like rocks being dropped through the trees, just like a decent chunk of rock falling from the top of a tree, going thunk, 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 as it hit branches on the way down. I'm a scientist, a skeptic, and usually quite a logical person, but I have to say that I was really freaked out. I tried to reason with myself and said, "Oh, you're being silly and scaring yourself. It's acorns. Of course. Just acorns. Acorns. Just acorns." It also was a consolation that the dogs were outside and not barking, but honestly, with as weird as it felt, and with all the weird noises coming from all directions around our campsite, I have no idea how the dogs weren't bothered by it. We spent an uneasy hour listening to these noises, and because we were a bit afraid that the guy in the parking lot might have had bad intentions and followed us in, we finally just felt too vulnerable in the tent. We were able to get the fire started again by stoking the embers, and we sat up, drinking the remainder of our wine to calm our nerves until the sun came up. The next day, Trying to make the previous night less scary, I looked all around the campsite for acorns. I couldn't believe it, but there were none. None of the trees around were oak trees, but were some sort of evergreen. I didn't find pine cones either. Honestly, I really wanted a non-creepy explanation, and I couldn't find anything that would cause what I heard all night long. We both agreed that we felt like we'd experienced some weird Blair Witch shit, and quickly packed up and booked it out of there the next morning. We talked about it on the entire trip back, how scary and weird it felt. But neither of us could figure out how such large branches could get snapped all around us without any other sign of movement. What the hell was falling through the trees, if it wasn't acorns or pine cones? Just to make the whole thing creepier, we Googled the part of the AT where we camped and discovered that there had been 2 sets of grisly murders, 10 years apart. The women murdered were lesbian couples camping, as were Jen and I. The first murders were in 1986, the next in 1996, and the year Jen and I went camping in that area, 2006. Story number 4. About a month ago, me and my friend T went camping. We decided to go to a state campground and camp near a river. It was a nice place and very secluded. The area was, as Michigan is, a large woodland area. There were miles and miles of forest out there. It was a fairly ordinary camping trip until we found something while exploring the woods. Whatever it was, it is something I don't wish to encounter again. The first day was a fairly normal day. We did some swimming and exploring down the small river. About a half-mile down the river, after taking a turn, we found an old teddy bear, half buried, half submerged in water on the pine tree-lined shore. It seemed to have been there for years and was caked in dirt. It was strange, but we didn't think much of it. Some kid probably lost it. The rest of the day went pretty normally. We both slept well that night after a few beers. The next day, we decided to do some exploring. We traveled a few miles down a road through the woods. We found some empty camping areas, but nothing odd at this point. We found a roundabout dirt road pulling off the main road. We followed it to a strange campsite. It was next to a massive hill with the river at the bottom. The hill had 2 deadfalls on it and several tall, long-dead trees. Across the river was a marsh. There were old wooden steps leading into the water, which was strangely dark and deep in this spot. I stopped near the stairs and stared into the water. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I could have sworn I heard a voice beckon me to jump in. Then I saw it. A face under the water, totally still, staring up at me. It appeared to be a severely pale woman. I stared in disbelief at the motionless face for a couple minutes, when it suddenly smiled and sank deeper into the water, out of my sight. I just stood there, dumbfounded. I figured I was seeing shit, and promptly went back up to T, who was investigating one of the deadfalls. "Hey man, what was so interesting in the water?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, not wanting him to think I was insane. "What's so interesting about that deadfall, man?" He suddenly looked a bit nervous. "Well, I know it sounds crazy, but I could have sworn I heard a little girl crying under this deadfall, but it stopped when I came over and started looking. I have no idea what the fuck it was," he said. He looked confused and frightened. We decided to leave the area and continue exploring. We hiked about 3 miles down the road and found a small road blocked by a decomposing fallen tree. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was partially overgrown and had absolutely no tire tracks. We climbed over the log and followed down the road. The forest was especially dense here. We walked nearly a mile down this twisting and curving road, deep into the woods. There was no sign of anyone being down here in years until we passed a fresh set of footprints on the road. It would have been strange no matter what, but these were footprints of bare feet. a mile down an unused road in the middle of dense, secluded forest. We decided to keep going, and probably made it another mile before the road ended. It just stopped abruptly, but a small foot trail led into the forest. We followed it for a half-mile until we saw an old dilapidated cabin. We were surprised to see it out here. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. We decided to take a look inside. This was a mistake. We approached the cabin slowly. We noticed a strange, nasty smell. I approached the old battered door and turned the rusty old knob. The door creaked open and we were greeted with a dark room. The cabin had no windows, so the only light was from the partially open door. I stepped inside and pulled out a flashlight and turned it on. I was greeted by a terrifying sight. The cabin was full of rotting animal carcasses. Some were strewn about and some were hanging on fucking hooks. They were everywhere, and bones were scattered across the floor. We promptly turned around and sprinted away. As we made it back on the unused road, we heard a terrible scream. It sounded like a feral man screaming in wild rage. We sprinted all the way back to the fallen tree and climbed over it and speed-walked a couple of miles down the road until we were sure we were away from whatever the fuck lived in that shack. Nothing else strange happened until that night. We couldn't sleep, and around 1 a.m. we heard something very odd and out of place. It sounded like it was coming from the river. A child crying. The crying got louder until it turned to horrific, blood-curdling screams. We couldn't take it. We had to go investigate. Upon exiting the tent, we were greeted with absolute blackness. There was no moon that night, and it was very cloudy. We turned on our flashlights and walked down to the river. The crying was coming from around the bend in the river where we found the old teddy bear. I turned to T to say, "Fuck this," when I saw something behind him. It was like a man. Sort of. He was at least 7 feet tall and had long white, ratted hair. He was extremely thin and was pale as a ghost. His eyes were completely white. Just as I was about to scream to T, the man grabbed him by the shoulder. His hand was skinny, and his fingers were extremely long, at least twice as long as a regular man's fingers. He yanked T back and let out a scream much like the one we heard before. Then with inhuman speed and strength, he ran with T screaming into the woods and fucking jumped up into a tree. And jumped from tree to tree until he was gone. I heard one last blood-curdling scream from T, and then silence. I ran a mile to the road and flagged down a car for help. The police investigated the area but found nothing. The road we had gone down wasn't even there. According to the authorities, a road was there in the early 1900s, but was pretty much overgrown and gone in the 1950s. I had absolutely no idea what to think. I pleaded with them to check where the road was, and they did. They couldn't follow after a certain point, as it led into an impassable marsh. They closed the investigation after this and assumed we got drunk and T wandered off. After this experience, I have no idea what to do. I haven't heard from T since then, and he is still missing. I have no idea what took him, but I know it's still out there. Whatever it is, it's dangerous and malevolent. I don't think I will ever go camping again. Well, Wednesday we went back. I brought 3 friends with me. I'll call them DS and L. It was about 5 p.m. when we reached the Cadillac Pathways State Campsite. My friends were all skeptical of the events I told them about. They wanted to see all the locations I had pointed out and hoped to find some trace of T. We set up camp at the site on the hill near the river. Just being back there sent a chill down my spine. I went down to the bottom of the hill to the stairs. Nothing was different. Still 2 old wooden steps leading into a dark, deeper section of the water. I looked down into the water. Nothing. I was relieved, but also knew what I saw last time. I really didn't want our base camp to be here. It took us about an hour to prepare camp. After this, much to my dismay, my friends L and D went off to scout out the woods while me and A were getting dinner ready. I tried to plead with them to stay, but they refused. It was still daylight, around 7, so they felt safe. 2 nervous hours went by before my friends returned. The second I saw them, I jumped up to talk to them. As I approached, I noticed something that made me nervous. They both looked extremely bewildered and refused to tell me if they had seen anything. They just sat down and ate dinner in silence. It was getting dark, and the sun was setting. Much of the ground was cast in shadow now, and the orange sky hung gloomily over the treetops. The wind was still, and all we could really hear was the rushing of the small river. At this point, my friend S said that we should set out. L wanted to remain and watch the camp, but reluctantly joined us. I tried again to figure out what they'd seen, but they still said they saw nothing. S suggested we check the woods adjacent to the river and north of the dirt road roundabout. L and D both refused, rather nervously, saying they had already been out there and that there was nothing of interest. We went anyway, as we wanted to see what had them so nervous. We entered the woods. The forest was strange here. The trees were much girthier and more spread apart, with patches of dirt and muck everywhere. There were also sections of dense brush that were very difficult to pass through. We walked about a mile along the river until it turned again, blocking our path. We had to follow east along the river now, deeper into the woods. It was getting dark, and we had to use our flashlights. The further we walked, the more frightened L and D seemed. The area we were in was extremely remote. We were about 2 miles from the camp and the nearest path when I noticed something. Silence. Only the faint flow of the river could be heard at this point. The only light aside from our flashlights was the moon. Shortly after the woods got quiet, we began noticing strange things. Tiny red lights would appear and disappear immediately from random sections of the forest. At this point, I felt a feeling of dread wash over me. I prompted everyone to turn back, but we heard something move around from the area we had come from. We decided to keep following the river until we found another trail. As we walked along the river, we'd notice a red light every 15 minutes or so. After an hour or so, it was the dead of night, and even the river seemed eerily calm. The sheer silence was abruptly interrupted when we heard what can only be described as a howl. It sounded like a coyote, but there was something very wrong. It almost sounded artificial. This sound occurred once before we were greeted again with silence. After about a half hour of frantic walking, we finally reached a tent. There were 2 older men outside it, sitting around a fire. They seemed startled by us, but when we explained why we were out here, they understood and walked with us back to our camp, telling us they'd meet with us tomorrow. We all went to sleep when we got back. Around 4 a.m., I was woken up by the sound of sobbing. It was low, but I knew what I was hearing. It sounded like a young woman. I nearly got up to go outside and investigate when I heard splashing, then silence. It took me an hour to fall back asleep. The next day, the men came back to our camp and told us some stories. They both had seen strange things back here over the years and were more than willing to tell about them. Apparently, the road that me and T had ventured down, that turned out to be an impassable marsh, was a place that absolutely no one goes to for any reason. They told us that strange things have happened out here for hundreds of years and pointed out that many of the small mounds in the area were Native American burial mounds. The sightings of red lights, strange silences, and terrifying sounds were common out here. They also told us of many disappearances that went unsolved, as well as a mother and child drowning in the river and their bodies washing up 10 miles downstream. And finally, they spoke again of the marshes, saying that a creature is said to inhabit that area, and there have been legends of said beast for thousands of years among the natives. The marsh itself was said to defy explanation, stretch much further when one is within than should be possible. The men changed the topic to that of recreational activities that could be performed out here. After a while of talking, the two men left. We got ready for our next walk. We were going into the marsh. After a couple hours, we finally arrived. Surely enough, the road wasn't there, though there was a small deer trail. We followed it for about an hour straight into the dense forest until we found it. The marsh. The trees out here were mostly dead, and the shrubbery was so dense it was hard to tell where there was solid ground and where there was water. We waded through the marsh for about half a mile before we ran into a large pond. The water here was black and very, very deep. My friend grabbed an extendable pole he brought for this purpose and tested the water. It was over 50 feet deep. The ends of the pond had small but equally deep streams stretching into the marshlands around us. We had no choice. We had to swim it. We all managed to get over it fine. However, as we reached the shoreline on the other side, we were greeted with an eerie sight. There were extremely deep ponds dotted all over the marsh from here on out, as far as the eye could see. As I scanned the marshland, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of a distant pond, a figure rose straight out of the water. It was T. He looked pale, and he was covered in underwater weeds and mud. He beckoned for us to come to him. His movements were stiff, awkward, and jerky, and there was no way in hell any of us were fucking swimming to him. After 2 minutes of beckoning, he suddenly pointed at us and screamed. The sound was horrifying and loud, and seemed to resonate through the marsh in an unnatural fashion. Then T suddenly sank back into the water, and a pale arm came out of the water and latched onto my foot. I screamed, and it took all 3 of my friends to get the arm off. At this point, we swam back across the pond and left the marsh as fast as possible. When we got back to the woods, I turned around to look at the marsh. On a small patch of ground, I saw the creature I had seen a couple weeks ago. It was a tall man with white skin, long matted white hair, unnaturally long fingers, and white, featureless eyes. It bared its teeth. They were jagged and sharp, and there seemed to be rows of them. The creature screamed, and my friends all began to sprint. I joined them. When we finally got back to camp, we had no idea what to do. We didn't want to stay another night, but we figured we would leave at the first sign of danger. By the time evening rolled around, spirits weren't any higher. Just as the sun went down, we heard the same scream ring out again. Shit. Suddenly, one of the older men from earlier that day came sprinting to our camp. He was frantic. He described the creature exactly as we had seen it and said it had stalked up to his camp and took his friend into the trees and went tree to tree until it was gone. He said it made a terrible scream and that he'd been hearing it following him all the way to our camp. We all decided to get the fuck back to civilization and accept T's fate. We didn't even bother taking the tent down. As we ran up the road, the screams got closer. Red lights began flashing again, but this time, it was all around us, almost constant. We noticed strange faint sounds that grew to shrill, blood-curdling screams from all directions. Even the trees seemed to be alive. The branches seemed to stretch out toward us as we ran. With the horrific cries getting louder, we tried to sprint faster, but we couldn't. We started to see figures running in the woods all around us, and the screams got louder and louder. The old man fell from exhaustion, and we turned around to help him, only to see the pale monster grab him up with its long, slender fingers and jump off of the road onto a nearby hill. and over the other side. We continued running. The screams stopped, and the lights lessened as we got closer to the entrance. We quickly packed up our car and drove out. Just as I turned to look back at the trail, I saw the creature at the entrance. It was just standing there, staring at me, mouth ajar, revealing its terrible, sharp, crooked rows of teeth. I just kept staring as we peeled out and went speeding down the road. This time, the police had too many witnesses to blow it off and have already sent an investigation team out there. D&L later revealed that the day before, they saw a Native American shaman beckoning them to leave from a swamp on the other side of the river, and they immediately returned to camp. I have no idea what the fuck is out there, but I am never returning to that place. This will be my last update on this. There are things out there that defy explanation, and they are best left alone. If you feel brave enough to go out there, then by all means do. But be wary of the river and stay the hell out of the marsh. You've reached the end, but the shadows haven't left you. If this story unsettled you, prove you survived. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows, and leave a comment with the part that haunted you most. The darkness is always waiting, and so are we. Until next time, don't turn off the lights.